I was blessed, and I mean blessed, to be raised as a missionary child in Kenya. My parents had really dreamed and prayed about going as a missionary somewhere overseas. And when I was 2 years old, they got the call to go to Africa as missionaries. And so we boarded a train in Detroit, took that train all the way down to New Orleans. And from New Orleans, we got on a big ship, an ocean liner, not a cruise boat, but a ship that took all sorts of cargo. And we sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean for 4 weeks. We sailed that ocean to Cape Town in South Africa. And while we were on the boat, my brother and I, he was 4 and I was 2, we would do puzzles and read books and just play out there in the sunshine. And when we got to Cape Town, we stayed there for almost a month. We had a little house, and we could actually look out over the bay and at the Atlantic Ocean. And the flowers were amazing in South Africa that time of year. And we waited there for my parents' work permit. They never got it we were headed to Tanzania. They never got it. And finally, somebody said, well, we can get you work permits for Kenya. So they said, we'll take it. So the work permits came through, and once again, we went down to the harbor. We got on the Kalahari, another ship, and for 5 weeks, we traveled up the coast of Eastern Africa. My brother and I had become very bored with puzzles and books, and so our new entertainment, because this ship didn't have mesh along the railings like the other ship, it just had 2 bars. Our new entertainment was running out and grabbing hold of the railings and swinging out over the turquoise blue Indian Ocean and then coming back. And my mother chased us, she said, for 5 weeks, trying to get us to stop doing that, but it was just way too much fun. So eventually, after stopping at every port, loading and unloading things, we made it to Mombasa, Kenya's main port. And from there, we took the train inwards to Nairobi. And then from Nairobi, we went out to a really remote area called Kisii, where we lived on a farm and had cows and goats and all sorts of domestic animals, plus animals that probably should have been left in the wild, but we decided we would tame them and have them in the house with us. And then I attended British schools. I learned about Livingstone's explorations and all sorts of things that pertain to Kenya. My parents were very worried about how we would ever adapt to life back in America, having really learned nothing about Columbus or American holidays or anything like that. From there, we moved to Beirut, Lebanon. We lived there during the worst part of the Civil War, spent a lot of time in the bomb shelter, and I attended school there. While I was in Lebanon, probably I experienced I would say one of the worst experiences of my life. It altered and it changed me forever. And I could not find it in me to share that experience with anybody. So I held it deep inside of me. I didn't talk to my parents. I didn't tell anyone. And I was still young, probably about 12 years old. And I just tucked it away deep inside of me. And because of the war, we actually were evacuated. The division where we worked was evacuated to Nicosia, Cyprus. When we got to Cyprus, there was no school for my brother and I. So my parents sent us to Far Eastern Academy in Singapore to go to school. And that was really hard on me. We were, back in those days, you didn't have email, you didn't have cell phones. So communication with family was hard. We only went home at Christmas time and summer. And you're still young. You're 12, 13 years old to be traveling all by yourself, and 14 being away from home for that long without any communication was really hard. And I found it hard to, in general, just being there. Most of the missionary kids that were at that American boarding school were from Asia, and they were raised in Asia, even though they might have been Americans. And I had been raised in Africa, and so it was just really hard for me to fit in. I felt uncomfortable. I felt different. And even though I looked the same as everybody else, I realized that inside of me, my heart was African, and I had just been raised in a totally different way than everybody there. So from there, my parents moved back to the U.S., and so after school was over that year, my brother and I flew back to the States, And that was probably one of the hardest times in my life, adapting back to life in the U.S. Everybody, family, everybody you knew thought you should feel the same way as other Americans felt, and yet I didn't have those feelings. I had gone to school at British schools. I had learned different things. I didn't know about Christopher Columbus travels. I didn't. I spelled words in British ways, not in American ways, and holidays didn't mean anything to me. And I didn't know the Pledge of Allegiance. I didn't know the American anthem, but I could sure sing the Kenyan one in English and in Swahili. And so it was just really hard for me to adjust to life there, and I longed to go back to Kenya. And I think inside of me, I just knew as soon as I could, I was going to head back to that country. Kenya held my heart, and I knew I had to go back. And so I went to college, I got married, we had 3 children, and then we got the call to go to Kenya. They wanted my husband to be the campus pastor, and I had numerous jobs they wanted me to fill in for. And so we headed back, and I was just so excited to be going back to Kenya. And once we were back there, I worked with the students that were there. I realized that my experience in Singapore, how lonely I was and far from family, was now something I could do to make a difference for these kids that were far from family as well. And so we opened our home up. We invited kids down to eat anytime they wanted, to take hot baths, just to feel like they were part of a family again. And it was amazing how my life changed. I felt that all the hard things I had been through as a child, all the traveling, all the feeling of being away from family, now I was starting to feel like I had purpose, like all of that was for a reason. And as a child, I had been exposed to Maasai people. They're polygamous. They're, for the most part, polygamous. And the female genital mutilation, early childhood marriage, all of those things I knew about, but now I was right back with them again. And as an adult, I was fascinated by it. And so I would spend time in their villages asking them questions, trying to figure out more, gleaning everything I could about their traditions and why they did things, and just wanting to know everything. And because I had a good relationship with most of them, I could ask very detailed questions that probably the average person couldn't have gotten away with. But I found myself drawn to FGM, to girls that were enduring that, and I just wanted to know more. And I would sit by the bed of girls that had been hospitalized. They endured female genital mutilation. They had been married off, and at the age of 8, 9 years old, found themselves back in hospital from with infections, being just torn from being married to men 50, 60 years old, and they're just children, and their bodies were ravaged with infection. And I just knew that I had to do something. Everybody around me seemed oblivious, or they didn't care. It was just okay. It was tradition. And I thought to myself, I need to be a voice for these little girls. I need to stand up and say something. And it was during that time that I started to wonder, what is it that is drawing me to this? Why am I so passionate about something like this? And I realized then that the experience that I had when I was in Lebanon, that had been so life-changing to me, was now playing a huge part in my passion for these little girls. I was probably in 7th or 8th grade back in Lebanon when a family friend, he asked me to go for a walk up the hill behind where we lived. And I trusted him. He was a bit older than me, but we had known him for years. Our whole family knew him, so I decided I would go with him. And I remember we walked up to the top of the hill, and when we got to the top, there was a secluded area, and he forced himself on me up on top of the hill where there was nobody to help me, nobody to hear anything. And I remember pleading for him to let me go, to not do this to me. And my pleas fell on deaf ears. And I remember walking back down the hill and saying to myself, I can never tell anybody about this. I was embarrassed. I felt shame. I felt like I didn't have value. My heart was broken. And I never told anybody. I never told my parents. I never shared with anybody. And probably for 30-some years or more, I relived that moment every day over and over. And you, when you go through something like that, you truly relive every single thing about it. And I still never shared it with anybody. It just was something inside of me that I was ashamed of, and I couldn't find it in myself to share with anybody. And then when I had gotten married, I actually shared it with my husband. But it tormented me. It just was something I couldn't get away from. And there was one day as an adult when I was in Kenya with a mission group, and it was my turn to have worship. And I remember laying in my tent in the early morning thinking, Lord, what am I going to share? What is it that I can say for you that would be meaningful, that would impact somebody's life? And it was like he spoke directly to me. And he said to me, you know, Kim, you have scars within you, scars that nobody else sees, that you hold inside of you, and they hurt you. But he says, I have scars too. I have them in my hands and I have them in my feet. And I chose those scars. They're visible to everybody. I chose them just for you. I chose them just for every person in this world. And because I chose those scars, someday your scars will be gone. And I will have my scars forever. But you won't ever even think of yours. You won't feel them. They'll be totally gone. And I think that moment was such an eye-opener to me. I realized how much God loves me, how much he loves each of us. But I realized, too, that he can take something so negative, so demeaning, so shameful, and he can turn it into something really so beautiful. And I realized then that if that had not happened to me, I probably wouldn't be as passionate as I am about FGM and what the girls go through. They're ashamed. They don't want to talk about it. They don't feel value in their lives. And they're scarred. In so many ways, it was so similar to what had happened to me. And so I think it was at that point that something that was so negative in my life really turned into something so beautiful. And now every time I think about it, and you still think about it, it's such a different feeling. I can praise God. People have different ideas with theology and stuff, but I'm not trained in that area, but I believe without a doubt that God allows certain experiences and things to happen in our lives. Does he cause them? No. But does he allow them? Yes. Because sometimes by allowing those things to happen, it helps us to grow. It helps us to learn. It's a stepping stone. And if we give our lives to him, he can take that and really make something meaningful out of it. And now I tell people, and I really feel this way, I would redo that day on the hill every single day if I knew that it would save one girl's life. And so out of all of this came the Omalaika home. And I firmly believe it's because God took a really bad experience and made it something beautiful.